Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Jennifer, and this is Procudex. Have you ever been told, you need to upgrade your DCS now? And when you ask why, nobody can show you an actual risk analysis. And if you are responsible for OT, you know this meeting. You're sitting there with your DCS supplier, maintenance manager, maybe IT, maybe corporate security, and someone drops the sentence, your system is obsolete, so it's insecure. And you're thinking, okay, but where exactly is the risk coming from? Because here's the part most people don't realize. If you make the wrong decision here, you don't just waste money. You can create more downtime, more complexity, and sometimes you actually increase your cyber risk. But if you do it right, you regain control. You avoid expensive mistakes, and you reduce risk without blindly migrating anything. Now I know what some of you are thinking already. Yeah, but end of support is real, right? Isn't an obsolete DCS automatically unsafe? Great question. And in this episode, we'll break it down the way engineers should. Risk-based, architecture-based, and aligned with how OT security standards actually define risk. So let's start with the biggest myth in industrial automation. Legacy doesn't mean unsafe. Poor decisions do. Before we start, let me explain what this series is really about. This is not an instruction series, and it's definitely not another vendor story. This series is for engineers, for OT managers, for plant managers and decision makers who are honestly tired of making decisions based on fear, tired of being told that their DCS is suddenly unsafe without anyone being able to clearly explain why. And when a DCS vendor or integrator says, your legacy system is unsafe, what they often really mean is, your system is old and we want to sell a migration. And this is where vendors often quietly stop explaining things. And that's exactly the problem. Maybe you've experienced this yourself, because in industrial environments, fear-based decisions usually create more risk, not less. So, in this series, we're going to break down one of the biggest challenges in industrial automation today. How do you manage legacy or obsolete DCS systems without blindly upgrading, without vendor pressure, and without increasing operational risk? We're not going to oversimplify this, because there are real risks involved. We'll talk about real risks. No marketing slides, no scare tactics, just engineering reality. And if at some point you think, yeah, this finally sounds like someone who understands my world, then this series is for you. Now, before we dive into today's topic, let me quickly show you the roadmap, because this is a 3-episode series, and every episode builds on the previous one. And I'm doing this on purpose, because I want you to know exactly what's coming, and why each episode matters. Today is episode 1, Legacy or Obsolete DCS Unsafe. We break the myth, and we get clear on what risk actually means. Then the most important follow-up episodes are Episode 2, Reduce Risk Without Replacing Anything. Practical steps you can apply without forcing a DCS migration. Episode 3, When an upgrade or migration actually makes sense. This is not because of pressure, but because it's the right engineering decision. So, if you're responsible for a DCS environment, or you're facing vendor pressure, or you want to avoid expensive mistakes, you'll want to watch these episodes. Quick favor before we dive in. Subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. And if you've ever been in a meeting where someone said, we must upgrade now, hit, share, and like this video, and drop a comment. All right, let's go. In industrial environments, there's one statement I hear again and again. Our DCS is obsolete, so it must be insecure. And I get it. On the surface, it sounds logical. I mean, if something is old, then it must be risky, right? That's how most people think about it. But from an OT security perspective, and honestly, from an engineering perspective, that assumption is fundamentally wrong, because old doesn't automatically mean unsafe. It just means it's been around for a long time. Legacy DCS systems are not some rare exceptions in industry. They're the norm. And they're still here for a reason. Not because companies are lazy, not because engineers don't care, but because these systems run critical processes 24/7, often with zero tolerance for downtime. So the real question isn't, is it old? The real question is, what's the actual risk and where is it coming from? Let's be honest for a second. A lot of legacy DCS systems have been running for 15 years, 20 years, sometimes even 30 years. And the truth is, they're not just old systems. They control critical processes, they control product quality, they control safety-related operations, they control high-availability production environments where downtime is not an option. And these systems were never designed to be replaced every few years. They were designed to run, to keep running, day in, day out. They were designed for stability, determinism, availability. And in OT environments, stability is not a weakness, it's a requirement. Because a stable system that behaves predictably is often the safest thing you can have in a production environment. So, the question isn't, is it old? The real question is, what changed around it? Because that's where the story gets interesting. When people say a system is obsolete, they usually mean one of three things. Number 1, vendor support is limited, or it's simply getting expensive. Number 2, patching options are limited. Maybe the OS is old, maybe the platform doesn't support modern updates anymore, or the testing effort becomes unrealistic. And number 3, it doesn't align with modern IT security expectations. And yes, those things are real. I'm not denying that. But here's the important part. None of those automatically translate to unacceptable operational risk. And this is where I want to be very careful, because I'm not attacking IT here. In IT environments, fast change is normal. Systems are updated constantly. Threats evolve quickly, and new vulnerabilities show up pretty much every day. So, in IT, old often becomes a problem faster. That makes sense. But OT is different. In OT, uncontrolled change is actually one of the biggest sources of risk. You can't just patch a DCS the way you patch a laptop. You can't reboot a plant like you reboot a server. Because the moment you do that in OT, you're not improving security. You might be creating downtime, production loss, or even safety incidents. OT requires engineering discipline, testing, planning, verification, and control. And that's the part that often gets missed. So, when someone brings IT logic into OT and says, old equals insecure, they might have good intentions. They might even be trying to help. But the conclusion is wrong. Because in OT, the question is not, how old is it? The real question is, how well is it controlled? This is exactly why OT security standards make a very clear distinction between age and risk. Risk is contextual. It depends on exposure, architecture, connectivity, and impact, not on the manufacturing date of a controller. A legacy DCS that is well segmented, well understood, and well managed can be far safer than a modern system that is connected everywhere, integrated poorly, and managed without control. So again, legacy does not mean unsafe. Poor decisions do. Now here's the part most people miss. Most legacy DCS systems did not become risky because they got older. They became risky because their environment expanded. Over time, networks grow. Plants add historians. They add remote access. They add third-party connections. They add OT data pipelines. They add MS. They add ERP integrations. And slowly, the DCS that used to live in a controlled world starts to get touched by systems it was never designed to trust. And this is where risk starts to grow, not because the DCS is old, but because the exposure changed. And this is usually the moment when things go sideways, because it often happens suddenly. You get an audit, a corporate security review, or there's an incident somewhere in the industry, and then someone says, "We have legacy systems." And immediately the conclusion becomes, they must be unsafe. And then, boom, Now you have pressure, budget discussions, vendor workshops, migration proposals, and no one can clearly answer the simplest question: what is the actual risk we're trying to reduce? That's the moment where engineering needs to step in. Let me say this in a calm way. Vendors talk about lifecycle management. Engineers talk about risk. Vendors talk about end-of-support dates. Engineers talk about operational impact. Vendors talk about roadmaps. Engineers talk about OT architectures. That doesn't mean vendors are evil, but it does mean their incentives are different. An end-of-support date is not a risk assessment. It's a commercial milestone. And if your decision is based on lifecycle marketing instead of engineering analysis, you are not managing risk. You're reacting to pressure. Good engineering teams don't start with replacement. They start with understanding. They ask questions like, what is the real exposure of this system today? What is connected to it? What paths exist into it? What's the impact if it fails? What's the impact if it gets manipulated? Because in OT security, impact matters. Availability matters. If you upgrade your way into downtime, you didn't improve security. You just bought a new problem. Here's something that might sound counterintuitive. A legacy DCS can be safer than a modern system, not because it has more features, but because it has fewer moving parts, less complexity, less integration, less remote exposure, and it's usually more predictable. Modern environments often introduce risk through convenience, remote access because it's easy, cloud connections because it's trendy, open integrations because management wants dashboards, and suddenly your security boundary disappears. So again, the legacy system isn't the enemy. Uncontrolled connectivity is. So what's the right approach? Start with risk understanding, not replacement. Map your architecture. Map your connectivity. Identify exposure paths. Identify weak conduits. Control access. And only then decide, do we secure? Do we isolate? Do we redesign segments? Do we reduce connectivity? And sometimes, yes, eventually you upgrade. But not because of fear, because it makes sense. That's the difference between vendor-driven upgrades and engineering-driven upgrades. So if you remember just one thing from this episode, make it this. Obsolete doesn't mean insecure, and age doesn't automatically create unacceptable risk. Risk comes from exposure, from your IT/OT architecture, from weak OT conduits, from connectivity, the stuff that quietly grows over time. And honestly, risk comes from decisions made without evidence. So again, legacy DCS doesn't equal unsafe but poor decisions? Yeah, those can absolutely be unsafe. And here's the real benefit of thinking this way. When you stop replacing systems out of fear and start deciding based on actual risk, you can avoid spending hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions, on upgrades and migrations that don't actually reduce your risk. Instead, you focus on what really matters: controlling connectivity, tightening access, segmenting properly, managing remote exposure, and proving improvements with facts. Because in the end, it's not about buying something new. It's about being in control. All right, quick favor before you go. If this video helped you, do 3 small things for me. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs it. Because honestly, if you know someone dealing with vendor pressure right now, send them this episode. The next episode, we're going practical. And one more thing, if you need support managing your OT environment, reducing risk, or making the right upgrade decision without vendor fear, reach out to us at Procudex. You can contact us directly or visit procudex.com for more information. All right, see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.